Welcome, everyone, to Avoiding Common Financial Issues and Pitfalls live session. This live session reviews frequent compliance issues that come up during IG audits, corporation staff visits, and monitoring and compliance visits. The purpose is to make you aware of the findings and potential impacts on your organization. Yvonne Walker and myself, program specialists, will also share some stories as we go along to kind of bring it all home. So our objectives for today, in this session, we're actually going to review the primary issues and compliance findings from the IG audits and the CNCS site visits. We're going to evaluate the impact or potential consequences of each of the pitfalls, whether it's programmatic or fiscal. And because we want you to be successful in your project, we will identify preventative actions to help you avoid these common pitfalls successfully. So in your next site visits, compliance visits, or audit, you will be in perfect shape. Our live session features, we'll be using a few different features, and I'd like to just briefly go over them with you before we get started. We're going to have a couple of polling features. I think there's about 3 of them, and they have multiple choice that you're going to be able to select. It makes it a little bit more interactive this way, and it'll help us customize the presentation a little bit more and focus on areas that we feel you need a little bit more attention to. So, for example, if you all respond that you need more support in a particular topic area, then we can spend a little bit more time reviewing the content and answering your questions. To conduct the polling, we'll indicate when a poll is open and ask you to respond to the questions individually. We'll then let you know when the polling is closed, and the results will be auto-generated, and it'll be displayed real-time, so you'll be able to see the results on screen. We also have the chat feature, and we're going to ask you to enter your questions into the chat feature. We have an internal moderator, Sarah Forgy, who is going to organize and prioritize questions according to the topics presented as part of the session, as well as the frequency that the question was asked. We'll try to respond to as many questions as possible at the end of each section, but probably most of them will take place towards the end, at the very end of this presentation. However, it's very likely that not all the questions are going to be answered during the session, so we're going to take the questions and move them over to the message board in the FFMC booth. So make sure you check back there and check the message board frequently for your questions if they didn't get answered, and also just as an information board. The FFMC has an exhibit booth under the CNCS drop-down in case you haven't been there yet. You can visit it for the message board, and again, as I said, we'll address the questions that are answered during the session. So today's agenda. To begin, we'll spend a couple of minutes reviewing the basis for pitfalls and common issues. This is going to provide a brief overview of how these frequent compliance issues were identified. Then the majority of the session will be spent reviewing the 5 most common issues, their consequences, and preventative actions for each. Finally, time is reserved at the end of this session to ask questions and share experiences with each of these compliance issues. Because we are covering 5 different compliance issues throughout the session, we added a little menu bar at the bottom of each screen to remind you of just which one we're addressing at the same time, just so you don't get lost on what we're talking about at the given time. Pitfalls and common issues are derived from governing requirements such as federal regulations, OMB circulars, and improper payments and elimination and recovery act, known as IPERA. I'm sure you're all well aware of what all these things are, but we're going to go over some of them in a little bit more detail. We're also going to be using the guidance based on from the Office of General Counsel, Civil Rights, Equal Opportunity Requirements, and the National Service Criminal History Checks. Compliance findings are drawn from governing requirements. The federal regulations, such as the program guides, are specific for each of our programs for our foster grandparents, senior companion, and RSVP. OMB circulars, however, are the basis for fiscal requirements and are a government-wide basis. The Improper Payment and Elimination and Recovery Act is a process helped to achieve the President's goal of reducing wasteful spending, in part by reducing improper payments. Federal agencies make more than $2 trillion in payments to individuals and a variety of other entities each year. An improper payment occurs when the funds go to the wrong recipient, the recipient receives the incorrect amount of funds, or the recipient uses the funds in an improper manner. And IPERA strengthens financial management controls that the federal agencies, like us, can better detect and prevent improper payments. Reviews and audits are performed following all applicable regulations and guidance by program. Examples include guidance from the Office of General Counsel, Civil Rights, Equal Opportunity Requirements, and the National Criminal History Checks. All findings will cite the specific regulation or guidance that it's based upon. It's important to note that all reviews and audits are document-based. So whenever we have a finding, we tell you exactly from where it came and give you that resource so that you can go back and double-check what's been told. So our common issues or pitfalls. When audit and reviews revealed multiple compliance issues, today the focus will be on the 5 most prevalent ones. The common issues that will be discussed in today's session are volunteer eligibility. Volunteer eligibility requirements are specific to each of the programs, and they include like a volunteer's age or a criminal background check. There's a lot of different factors that go into volunteer eligibility. Inadequate time and activity reports or staff and volunteers who are not completing their timesheets or time activity reports correctly. This session will discuss both the requirements and what accurate timesheet completion looks like. Improper documentation for match in kind. This session discusses frequent ways in which match is improperly documented, such as recording an excess amount of match or recording match that wasn't approved or on your budget at all. Improper or undocumented criminal history check. This is a frequent challenge for us all right now. The session will provide a basic information on the findings and the potential preventative actions that you can take, but I hope you all took part in some of these other sessions that were offered at on the virtual webinars so that you can have a clear understanding of the requirements. Also, lack of written policies and procedures are often an issue. Though they will not be covered in depth during this webinar, there is another session on internal controls and compliance which goes into more details. Financial reports do not reconcile with the general ledger. For example, not doing a monthly bank reconciliation or charging items not on the approved budget. Accurate financial reporting is important. The session will discuss some of the frequent compliance issues that have arisen related to financial reporting. So now we're going to go into our first polling question. And we'd just like to get a feel for how many people have received a compliance visit during the past 6 years. So on your button, on your screen, you should see a yes or no. If you would check one, we've got about 15 seconds to do this. It'll be tabulated, and we'll get a feel for just how many of you have gone through this process recently or in the past 6 years or so. But just as a reminder, while we're waiting for this, I'd just like to talk a little bit about compliance visits and how they're scheduled. Compliance visits are mandatory once every 6 years, but every year CNCS does an annual assessment on all programs. We have to answer a bunch of questions about our programs, and it's based on a lot of criteria that, some of them are beyond your control, some of them are within your control, like the size of your organization, the turnover of staff, your reports, are they on time? And a lot of times, grouped together, these things can trigger a compliance visit before the 6-year mark. So, do we have any responses up there? Oh, we have a large group of people who have had a compliance visit. So, we would love for you to share some ideas or some feedback on how your compliance visit went in the chat if you have an opportunity that we can use as examples at some point during the presentation. If you're willing to share some good things or some bad things or some aha moments that you had, that would be wonderful. But for all experience, which is great. So now we'll move on to volunteer eligibility findings. We're getting into the first section. As you can see, the little bar down the bottom has volunteer eligibility lit up there. The first compliance issue we're going to discuss is volunteer eligibility, and the findings concluded that there was a frequent lack of documentation for volunteer eligibility, including the volunteer's age at the time of the enrollment, whether the criminal record was done and the time in which it was done, if the sex offender registry was done, and again, if they started prior to the NSOPW, and which is required for work with children of vulnerable populations. Findings also concluded that income eligibility at the time of enrollment and annual income eligibility checks for seniors, senior companions, foster grandparent programs were not verified. This highlights the importance of keeping volunteer files current and organized by frequent updating. And you should have some kind of system in place to let you know on what time frame you need to do these annual documented reports, and have some kind of checklist in your system to show what's there, what's accurate, what's current, and what's missing. So what is the potential consequence of not having these volunteer eligibility requirements? There are several potential consequences of volunteer eligibility compliance issues. Some are severe, and this includes all payments may be disallowed, including any stipends or volunteer reimbursements on the volunteers who don't have the documentation, or if all or most of the volunteers are undocumented or ineligible, all funds provided under the grant may be disallowed. And even if the extent and the severity is even further than that, then the whole grant could be terminated or other actions brought up. So it can be pretty severe, and that's why these are very important to keep track of. What are the preventative actions? Let's move on. In addition to ensuring that staff, which means you, understand the regulatory requirements, several preventative measures can be taken to ensure compliance with volunteer eligibility. Document age eligibility, income review, physicals, and other agreements, and maintain those copies in a file someplace. Conduct national service criminal history checks. It's important to understand the requirements for both grant-funded staff and the volunteers. And I want to repeat that. It's important to understand it for both staff and the volunteers. Our Knowledge Network has a large section dedicated to the regulations, tips to help you understand, checklists, and so on. It's really comprehensive. And we really encourage you to kind of bookmark that page so that you can refer back to it whenever you have a new volunteer come on, because the rules are so complicated that it's good to refresh yourself every time you bring a new volunteer, a new group of volunteers on. Written policies and procedures are your best defense and the best insurance that things are done on time and are complete. And I can't emphasize that enough. Policies and procedures are critical to project management. It also ensures that if somebody leaves, the new person coming in can pick up and just take off where the other person left and know what's important and what's got to be done at what time, and they'll have the tools to start it off. We should create policies that clearly delineate the requirements for eligibility, documentation, screening, who has the authority to make determinations and maintenance of records, who reviews decisions on eligibility, and who has the final sign-off for enrolling volunteers. But most of all, important is to follow the policies and procedures that you've actually established. And when you do so, just ensure that you use that as your basis for making your decisions. Also, incorporate internal controls so decisions and documentation are reviewed by other senior staff members in addition to the project director. For something this important, it's best to have a check and balances system in place. We can often miss things that a fresh set of eyes can pick up on. So it's not bad to have somebody, either your boss or somebody else in the office, take a look at your processes and your internal controls and review them as well. Periodically sample a random group of files based on a predetermined percentage. To take the number of volunteers that you have and come up with a percentage on an annual basis, do an internal review. Use our document, our compliance and monitoring guide, or create your own checklist on what's got to be reviewed annually. And go through your records and see just how complete they are. And then when you find mistakes, it's a great time to correct them before you have a compliance visit. But also let your advisory staff, your advisory council, and your supervisor know what the findings are and how you've gone about changing them, and where you need to make changes maybe in your policies and procedures. So far, these are just suggestions we have to help you better guide yourself to creating a system to make sure that all of your paperwork is done and on time. The next area we're going to cover is the time and activity findings. This next set of common issues is related to your timesheets, basically. Although we don't like to call it timesheets anymore, we like to call them time and activity reports. First, we're going to discuss the time and activity findings, and then the consequences, and again, some preventative actions for both the volunteers and the staff. Compliance findings found that there was inadequate documentation of time and activity reports, including unsigned time and activities reports, hours not adding up, missing time and activity reports, and requests for reimbursements for days that the volunteers were not actually serving at the time the request was made. In addition, specifically for staff, compliance findings uncovered time and activity reports where staff charged budgeted hours instead of actual hours. Staff incorrectly allocated time to other grants and activities such as fundraising or split responsibilities. For example, a senior corps grantee who manages both an SGP and an SCP program, but the director's activity report doesn't allocate the time between the two programs. The activity report only records total hours worked for the period, and along with other leave time and sick time. Time and activity reports should present an after-the-fact accounting of time, fringe benefits paid relative to the time worked, and that time record should account for all the time that you're worked. So your timesheet should account for 100% of your time that you're being paid for, whether it's through your programs or through some sponsor activities or through fundraising. But it should be an after-the-fact accounting of that time. So the potential consequences of this pitfall is that the unsupported time can result in disallowed costs. Again, since salaries are often a major block of our budget, this disallowed cost can really add up quickly if it's not done correctly. And what can we do to prevent that? The potential consequences of the time and activity issue can be overcome by employing the following preventative actions. And again, it's understanding your federal requirements for time and activity reporting by organization type. So know what type of organization you're with. You're with a not-for-profit, or you're with a state agency or an educational institution. All these things are governed by a different set of OMB regulations. Know which one you are and know where your OMB regulations are so you can take a look at it. As an example, for not-for-profit, any charges or awards for salaries and wages, whether they're direct or indirect costs, will be documented payrolls approved by a responsible official of the organization. And the distribution of salaries and wages to awards must be supported by personal activity reports. And this is basically from A122. The reports must reflect an after-the-fact determination of actual activity of each employee. Budget estimates before the services are performed do not qualify as support for charges to awards. Each report must account for the total activity for which employees are compensated and which is required in fulfillment of their obligations to the organization. And the reports must be signed by the individual employee or by a responsible supervisory official having first-hand knowledge of the activities performed by the employee. And the reports must be prepared at least monthly and must coincide with one or more paychecks. The next preventative action would be to develop written policies and procedures. And I think you've been hearing that time and time again through this whole webinar, through the whole virtual conference, how important it is to have policies and procedures. Examples of written policies and procedures include, separation of duties, delegation of authority, procurement and purchase procedures, codes of conduct for employees engaged in award and administration of contracts, travel, and so on. They should also include your time and attendance policy, how you go about awarding time off, how you also go about submitting time off, and to whom you report to. You should also conduct periodic sampling of time and activity reports. For volunteers specifically, you can use the time and activity reports aligned with the project type that contain required information for the volunteer to record all time and daily activities. Ensure time and activity reports are signed and dated by all the required parties. Lastly, for staff, complete your time and activity report for time allocated to the grant as federal costs or match. And keep in mind that someone with first-hand knowledge, as I said before, must certify the timesheet. So now we're going to take a look at a FGP or SCP timesheet, and you're going to see a little bit of examples there. Through your chat feature, if you can point out what a few examples are, maybe we can take a look there. Maybe you could read out what some of those errors are on the timesheet that people have noted. While we're doing that, I'll just read to you a little bit about how we set this up. Ricardo is a program director who works at Lupin County Senior Assistance. Every 2 weeks, he receives time and activity reports from his volunteers using the presented format. This week, he notices that a new volunteer, Don Green, may have a couple of mistakes in his timesheet. So again, if you could tell me what those mistakes are, that would be great. And I'll give you a little clue that there's 5 errors on this report. So Sarah, have we gotten any responses about what the errors could be on this timesheet?
Not as of yet. Would you like me to switch it over to the answer page?
Sure. So as you can see, the recorded hours versus times, on one line he recorded his hours as 8 to 12, and on the second one he recorded 2 hours. And it's actually asking for hours, so they don't really want to know what times he worked necessarily, but the hours that he worked. As you can see, the volunteer only indicates that they've had accompaniment, even though it says escort there, they've had accompaniment on some days and not on all days. And apparently the background check wasn't completed by this volunteer while working, so before he started working, so accompaniment is required. He also didn't know how to do his math well, so he has the wrong amount down there, 24 hours. And his distance from site to home is different. So that's a little bit of a clue that something was amiss there, that he either didn't record it properly or he had other things that he did along the way. The missing purpose for when travel with a client is reported. And it's so much easier if you include the purpose of travel on the timesheet so that you can ensure that the volunteer was actually working on the day when he was claiming mileage. Does anybody have any questions about the timesheet? Are you all able to hear me okay now? Well, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Match, and Yvonne is going to take over from here. Yvonne, take it away.
Thank you. So now we're going to discuss match findings, and there are several findings that we usually discover when we come out to monitor our grantees, and sometimes the match might be unreasonable. The match claims might not be necessary to operate your grant. The match is not allowable, and you cannot allocate that expense to the grant. So what you would need to do is make sure when you have any expense, you ask yourself several questions. Is this expense necessary for my grant? Is it allowable based on the cost principles? Is it necessary? Is it reasonable? And how can I allocate it to my program? And if you can't answer yes to all those questions, then you should contact your grants officer or maybe your program specialist. Match-covered expenses incurred outside of the grant award period. Each grant award is a 3-year period, but we have 3 budgeted years. If you're a 1-1 grantee, your grant starts January 1st. Your budget period is January 1st to December 31st of that year. Any expense from the prior year cannot be carried forward without prior approval from your grants officer and your program specialist. You want to make sure that all expenses, for example, we have leave. If your organization is providing leave to your volunteers, you want to make sure that the leave is paid out at the end of that budget year, not the grant year, the budget year. The grant period is a 3-year period, but you have 3 budgeted years. So you want to make sure each year is set different funds, and the funds are for only a 1-year period, not a 3-year period. You cannot use other federal funds as match. If you're using other federal funds, you would need that federal agency's approval, and you should submit that to your program specialist and your grants officer. Is the amount unreasonable or excessive? For example, in-kind contributions. Is it reasonable if you're receiving a basket for your recognition door prize? Is it reasonable, or is it the price escalated? If you're traveling to the national conference, are you traveling first class or are you traveling coach? Is that price reasonable? If it's not, then that would be a question cost once we come out to visit you. And also, claim match that was not related to the cost included in the approved budget. Once you have your approved budget, you cannot add any new line items to that budget. For example, if you have a division director or an executive director who's not on the approved budget, any expense like travel cannot be charged to the grant because they were not on the approved budget. And during that budget year, you cannot add any new line item. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide. So potential consequences of undocumented match. First, the match can be questioned. First, it will be questioned. If we come out to monitor you and you're using other federal funds, you do not have the approval from the federal agency, that amount will be disallowed. If your match is not met, for example, if your match, you have a 10% required match for that budget year, and it's not met, we're monitoring you, and then you have unallowable expenses. You want to make sure that you have other expenses, for example, space, recognition, in-kind contribution. You want to make sure any other expense that you have that can be allocated to your program, you want to have that, and you have to have it documented with all the information completed on it. We're going to go on to the next. Do you know your regulatory requirement for match? What is the requirement for non-federal match? You want to know that the same rules and regulations for federal funds is the same rules and regulation applied to the non-federal match. For example, non-federal match for FGP and SCP is 10%. If you're a brand new RSVP grant, the first year is 10%, the second year is 20%, and the third year and so on will be 30%. The FGP and SCP also have the required match of 10%, then we also have the direct benefit ratio, which means 80% of the federal funds that you expend should be spent on volunteer expenses. For example, it should be spent on recognition, volunteer travel, meals, and insurance. So 80% of your funds should be spent, federal funds for FGP and SCP should be spent on volunteer expenses, and that also includes your stipend line. For your in-kind contribution form, it should be completed. The form should have the name of the donor, description of contributed items or services, the date the service was received, the value of the contribution. The value of the contribution should be completed by the official representing donor with the name printed, the title, and his or her title. And also on the in-kind contribution form, it should have stated that funds received or funds used for that in-kind donation is not from a federal agency, like federal funds were not used for that in-kind contribution. For example, we have Head Start meals. You want to verify that the source of the funds is not attached to a federal grant or a federal CFDA number. Once the funds is allocated down to the state, it might lose the federal identifying number. You want to verify with that donor that the funds are not from a federal source, because remember, you cannot use federal funds as match without their approval. As you can see on this slide, we have the date, you can have multiple contributions from that one individual donor. If you have training on a monthly basis, or if you have multiple training at different sites and the same donor is donating his or her service, then you can have him or her fill out the information, the value, and so you can see was this obtained with support by federal funds. If so, you should indicate it and have some supporting documentation. Okay. You want to ensure that you maintain all documentation for match. Apply the same standards of documentation for match expenditures as for federal funds. You want to record your in-kind or other match when documentation is sufficient. You want to record all claim match in your accounting system. The same rules and regulations for the federal funds applies to the non-federal funds, which is the grantees match. Do not use match or in-kind from other federal source. You cannot use that without their approval. We're going to move on to the next slide. So we want to take a closer look at a match case. We have a donor who donated Avon products to create a gift basket to each volunteer at a volunteer recognition. As a gift for the annual RSVP recognition, one project was able to get goods donated from a local Avon distribution center and created 500 gift baskets filled with these items to be given to each volunteer. The project director is an enthusiastic frame of mind, went to the local Avon dealer and asked the current price for each item she received. Most items she found was discontinued, overstocked items. The total in-kind was valued at $50,000. Do you think that's reasonable? We had 500 gift baskets. Most of the items was overstocked or discontinued, and the value, the in-kind value, was $50,000. As a project director, do you consider that excessive, reasonable? Now we're going to open up the polls, and what is a legitimate in-kind donation? Was this a legitimate in-kind donation? Sorry. So we have 15 seconds to answer this question. And we're going to close the poll now. So we're going to walk through this scenario. First, we're going to ask yourself, does this meet the criteria for a match? Is it reasonable? Is 100% per volunteer reasonable donation recognition item? How can you allocate that expense to the grant? Is it allowable? Is it verifiable? Is it allowable under the OMB cost principles? And is it paid out of federal funds? Is it in the approved budget? Whether the cost is reasonable is $100 per volunteer reasonable. And as I can see, based on the answers from the poll, we all agree that B. Yes, the donation was great, but the value was overrated because we had the discontinued item and the overstocked item, so we would use the depreciated value. So this in-kind contribution will be questioned because to a grants officer looking at it or a program specialist, we're looking at it and it's like, okay, we understand that it's generous, but the cost per volunteer seems excessive because we have discontinued items and overstocked items. And most of the time you would sell it at an outlet store, which might be probably $3 compared to if it was sold for $10 per item. Is it in the approved budget? Well, we have to remember when we're preparing our budget is just a blueprint of the upcoming year. What's reported on your FFR, that's the actual expenses. So when we're thinking about our recognition, we're going to make sure that we go back to the prior year and see how much we expended on our prior year and what we want to do for the upcoming year and how much is it going to cost and who are we going to reach out to donate these items. So when we're looking at it, you can budget it at $100, but when you're doing your reports and you filling out the in-kind contribution form, you want to make sure that value is at a reasonable amount. We're going to go on to the next slide. How many of you are familiar with the state requirement for criminal history checks? Polling question, and we're going to start it now. I want to also remind you that this requirements vary from state to on a state-by-state basis, and it's your responsibility to know the requirement to ensure that you're in compliance with the rules and regulations. Okay, we're going to close the polling now. Well, criminal history check seems to be a little hot topic now, and a lot of us are, 86% says yes, we're familiar with it. That's really good. So we're going to move on to the criminal history check findings. There are several things for criminal history check that we want to make sure that first, you would need to establish a written policies and procedures for criminal history checks for staff and volunteers. There are several findings that were discovered in an area of criminal history checks. The volunteer start date of service the volunteer started before the national sex offender was completed. The national sex offender should be completed prior to the start of either an employee or a volunteer. It's free. You can go to the National Sex Offender website and you can complete that right then and there and just do a printout. Covered individuals cannot serve or work before the program completes the National Sex Offender. There is no allowance or exceptions to the National Sex Offender check, and having cleared individual accompany the individual has no bearing on the requirement to conduct the check prior to the service. So we want to make sure that the National Sex Offender is completed prior to the start date of the volunteer or staff. Once the staff starts or the volunteer starts, then on the first day, then the criminal history check should be initiated. While that check is being initiated, your organization should have an accompaniment policy. They should have the individual who's cleared accompanying the volunteer or the staff who's currently going through the background check. Potential consequences of not completing the required checks. The program may be required to pay the corporation for grant-funded costs, and that can be an extremely expensive finding. For volunteers, you would have to reimburse if the sex offender is not complete and the proper policies and procedures were not completed for the criminal history check. The volunteer's stipend, mileage, and any expense that was paid to that individual would have to be reimbursed to the corporation. For staff, any expense that was paid to them, whether it's long-distance travel, fringe, salary, that would have to be reimbursed to the corporation. Also, for a volunteer, the hours that the individual serves prior to being cleared cannot count towards the service. So when you're conducting when you submitting your report for the FFR every 6 months, if that individual is not cleared, you cannot report those hours. Preventative action. One of the main things that I would say that you should have in place is the policies and procedures. As an individual, a project director, you would ask yourself, what checks are required and for whom are they required? RSVP, the RSVP volunteers are not required to conduct a criminal history check. For FGP and SCP, both the staff and volunteers are required to conduct a criminal history check and national sex offenders, and also the RSVP staff. Anybody who have recurring access to the vulnerable population are required to conduct a criminal history check. So now we're going to go into expenditures and reconciliation findings. Grantees/sub-grantees not reconciling expenditures in their accounting system to the amounts that's reported in the FFR. As you are aware, the corporation has recently sent out requests for the Improper Payment and Elimination Act. And what we're doing, based on the reports, the last FFR for the 6 months that was submitted, we're sending that, because the information that's sent out to you is the information that you, as a grantee, submitted to the corporation as the funds that's expended. If the FFR, if your accounting system, the detailed general ledger is not reconciled to the FFR that's submitted in e-grants, then we would have to, one of the consequences, the cost not allowed for the difference between the accounting system, that can be disallowed. What you would want to do is as a project director, you want to have a monthly meeting with your accounting department. You want to ensure that the actual cost from your approved budget is being charged to your account appropriately in your accounting system. We want to make sure that your accounting system is only as efficient as the information that's being inputted into the accounting system. You want to make sure that you have a clear audit trail. When I'm saying have a clear audit trail, you want to make sure you follow your policies and procedures. If your organization have policies for your long-distance travel, are you following the policy of your organization? If you're required 2 signatures for anything that costs, any expense that costs $500 or more, did you get the appropriate signatures prior to going on the trip? We want to make sure that it's allocated to the correct line. We want to make sure that your accounting system has different accounting codes for both federal and non-federal. And if your accounting, by having monthly meetings, you can reconcile your expense and your accounting system prior to submitting your FFR on a semi-annual basis. And also once you're doing your 272 to payment management system, that's a good way to catch any discrepancies with the accounting system and your expenditures. We're going to move on to the next slide, and I think that is it. And if we have any questions.
And that is actually all the time we have. We did have many really good questions. Yvonne, can we tell them where those questions will be and the answers will be posted?
Well, the questions will be posted in the FFMC booth. And we'll try to get the questions and answers to you by tomorrow or the latest is Monday. So if you can please complete the survey at the end of the session, we will greatly appreciate it. We want to make sure that you remember to create policies and procedures. The policies and procedures are the backbone to your organizations. Once you have policies and procedures in place and you have a strong internal control in place and segregation of duties, then you should not have a problem with any finding. We want to thank you for coming out, and we truly appreciate the time that you've taken to attend our session.